I'd like to introduce Robin Hoffman. We first met Robin over a year ago when we initially thought of the idea of an alphabet book format to highlight our collections. Her illustrious career researching historical alphabet books, literacy, and her experience in collections engagement made her an obvious thought partner as we forged ahead with this unique project. Robin shared with us intriguing historical context surrounding alphabet books and, most importantly, expressed her enthusiasm for the project. As our release date approaches, she is an obvious choice to join us today to illuminate the unique history and landscape of adult oriented alphabet books, of which our book is now a part. As editor in the publishing department at the Art Institute of Chicago, Robin Hoffman works with curatorial departments to produce exhibitions, catalogs, and didactics. Her own research, for which she earned a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, focuses on Victorian era picture books and print culture, exploring ideas about how childhood and literacy intersected with developments in printing technology. Robin argues that these emerging technologies supported a strategic use of satire to address adult audiences alongside, and sometimes even instead of, the children these literacy tools may have initially been intended for. Robin's recent publications include The Dangerous Alphabet and the Dark Side of Victorian Domesticity, and the introduction to the Georgian and Victorian board games collection from the Lyman collection. In addition to her publications, she also has taught classes on the history of childhood, illustration, and women in literature. We are so pleased to have you with us today. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Jacquelyn. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with folks so you can see some of these images. And I think, can everyone see at least the beginning of this?
It looks great, Robin.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so as has obviously been implied, I'm very excited to be here today to talk with you about alphabet books. They're a personal passion of mine, both for collecting and for studying. And I understand that part of what probably drew you today may have been the particular alphabet book that this group is releasing, which is very exciting. I was glad to see the video. I also dare to imagine that this is a topic that so many people are familiar with because it's become an ingrained part of their personal histories, right? Both as children looking at alphabet books and illustrated alphabets and personified letters as part of their journey of learning how to read, and then interacting with children who are on that journey right now themselves, right? Whether that's by reading with them or watching Sesame Street together or doing any of the innumerable things that we do to help teach children how to read. And if you there we go. Have been doing these things, it's an exciting time to be shopping for alphabet books, right? They come in all kinds of wonderful flavors, and they're obviously a very potent way to share values with children in the course of teaching them a very important skill, right? So I've chosen to highlight just a couple here that I think speak to this. So I personally first encountered the alphabet for activists in the gift shop of the Brooklyn Museum, right? So that's kind of a double shot of learn about art, learn about activism. On the right-hand side, the B is for breakdancing, comes from the English Schoolhouse, which has a really wonderful series of books that are specifically aiming to diversify representation in children's books. And they have several alphabet books that are part of that effort, right? And in addition to this one, they have K is for Kahlo, as in Frida Kahlo, and Z is for Zora, as in Zora Neale Hurston. So they introduce their readers to a more diverse array of artists and writers. And meanwhile, Neil Gaiman is, of course, hugely successful as a novelist, and he's produced a number of children's books as well, including one called The Dangerous Alphabet, right, which is a very entertaining narrative, and it takes a couple of children along a journey that's not dissimilar from the ones that, that people go on in some of his novels, but of course is organized around the letters of the alphabet. And you may also have been drawn to this talk because you've also noticed that alphabet books are a genre that can appeal to adults as well. And of course, typography has in recent years become a more widely appreciated art form. Maybe you saw the documentary about Helvetica or something like that. Here's a couple of my favorite books that, like Amaze, that kind of literally animate the alphabet. So ABC3D came out a while ago, but it's like very, it's just the letters and some of them pop up and move. And the one on the right, A to Z, that came out more recently, these books are fragile and expensive, right? So A to Z on Marvels and Paper Engineering is a limited edition. It's a steal at $75. And it's so obviously lacking in educational ambitions that I don't think anyone really thinks that these are primarily or only for children. Although there are obviously oodles of books for children that do incorporate paper engineering, like pop-ups and flap and movements, right? So alphabet books are everywhere and everyone's reading them or will read them or has read them. So I think it's easy to lose sight of how weird they are. They're very familiar, but we learned the rules about alphabet books so long ago that we forgot that we learned them in the first place. And we even forgot to wonder why there are so gosh darn many of them. So in 2006, Emily Jenkins, who's a reviewer for the New York Times, was writing a review of children's books, and she finally stopped to wonder, teachers and parents, she said, are well supplied with books that teach the alphabet effectively, yet every year there are more. Why? Right? Wouldn't you think by now we've landed on the perfect combination of words and pictures, right? Or the perfect way of teaching everyone to learn how to read. And if we're lucky, we get so fluent at reading that we use a phrase like, it's easy as ABC, without recalling how difficult it was to get to that point, right? Especially in English. So I want to make that very clear that I'm talking about alphabet books in English, right? There's a whole world of other kinds of alphabet books and alphabets that we can talk about. But the alphabets, or the environments rather, where we tend to find alphabet books in use, right, which is school, or I'd say even more frequently the home, really help us naturalize the idea that learning how to read is a kind of developmental stage, right? One of the things that actually makes children different from adults, right? That's just one of the things they don't know yet. So a couple of weeks ago, Judith Flanders gave, I think, a fascinating talk talking about the history of alphabetical order. And so I want to talk a little about the history of the alphabet book, right, which is more specific as a format. But it's this nearly ubiquitous delivery system, right, for alphabetical order. So alongside the songs and the kinesthetic learning and the stories and everything else that we do, that's devoted to making this so very familiar as an organizing system. And the important thing, if you take on one thing, the bumper sticker from this talk, is that, alphabet books as we know them, with one page per letter, basically, is that they're a very quintessentially Victorian phenomenon. Right? This is as Victorian as Christmas, right? Because that's basically how long it took to develop the necessary printing technology and to develop children as a specific customer base. All right, so I'm going to start and just give you, this is a very cursory sense of what some 19th century alphabet books would have looked like, right? And even these kind of I don't know, crude colors and crude design, these were in their way a technological triumph at one point, right? Even once you've got Gutenberg and you've got printing itself worked out, it becomes very challenging to do it in a cost-effective way. Figuring out how to print in color, right, was its own hurdle to overcome. The mechanized production of paper and organizing the supply chain for producing paper was something that wasn't overcome until basically the Industrial Revolution, right? And so crude as they are, these proto-picture books, right, were distinctly more appealing and exciting and novel than the unillustrated primers and grammars that were usually found, in classrooms, and which continued the earliest practices of literacy instruction which were basically text-only devices, right? And you may have seen some of these things before. So on the left is a 19th century hornbook. This is in the special collections at the University of Pittsburgh, and it looks all nice and pristine, and partly because it's a relatively young example of this kind of object. And these kinds of bare bones forms of presenting the alphabet, right, were used from the mid 15th century onwards. And if you, were tuned in a couple weeks ago, you would have seen that Judith Handler's talking about one of these very early picture books, right? And Johann Comenius came out what we think of as one of the first picture books, and certainly one of the first illustrated alphabets, right? He had this book, Orbis Sensorialum Pictus, The Visible World in Pictures. Some of my colleagues, I think, have quite accurately compared, sorry, I'm navigating too fast here. Have compared the sensible world in pictures, or the visible world in pictures, to something like Richard Scarry books, right? Like everything that you see is labeled. It will present something like a barber shop, like it's drawn from real life, and it's attaching the words to these images, right? And it is like an alphabet. The particular version where the alphabet is illustrated, and because it has one picture per letter, right? But this is not precisely the alphabet book format that you're probably used to seeing, right? Where you provide a word that starts with each letter of the alphabet, right? If you just kind of look at this cursorily right here, you might get the sense that A stands for crow, right? So, but what it actually stands for, right, is the sound that the crow makes. So it's more like a pronunciation guide than a guide for introducing, right, the names of the letters, which is its own kind of complicated like consideration, right? That you have the letter, you have the name for the letter, you have the sound that it makes, we have the words that could be part of. So it all gets very complicated very quickly. But Comenius gets credit for making one of these first really like good efforts at printing something out there. But the prototype for the alphabet book as we know it is really the New England primer, right? Which first hits the shelves in about the late 17th century. And in this one, it looks, I think more like what you would expect from an alphabet book. One illustration per letter and a little bit of an example, right? And here A stands for Adam, as in the first man, from Genesis. B stands for book, and so on, right? With an image for each word. And their approach to the alphabet was primarily really about memorization and repetition, right? So less about learning the rules and then applying them than about memorizing all the combinations so that you'd recognize them when you saw them, right? Much more like sight reading or something like phonics that we have today. Right? So it introduces the letters with an illustration, and then what we also have are all these tables like listing all the syllables. Right, and then longer and longer words where it kind of tells you how these words break down into syllables. Right? And it is delivering moral lessons all along the way. Right, as you can readily see, a lot of these like verses and quotations, right, were about living an upright life, appreciating the value of reading itself as a means of studying the Bible. And as they kind of present these longer and longer words, I want to point out, like, people are always amused to see that one of the examples of a 5-syllable word is fornication, right? So it's a biblical word, but this kind of doesn't necessarily seem, to jive with what we usually think of as words in children's books. And so while the New England primer obviously was published in North America in late 17th century, another important foundation for alphabet books was published at almost exactly the same time in Europe. Right, so the philosopher John Locke published his late 17th century treatise, Thoughts Concerning Education, which honestly is still quite readable. I think if you are looking for pedagogical advice. Right? So this is not that surprising, really, right? The United States and the UK are sharing ideas and technology, throughout all this time period. And Locke declared that illustrating a primer or an alphabet would, quote, teach children how to read while they thought they were only playing. Right? And he suggested some ideas for how to go about making that effect, creating that effect. He actually suggested toy locks. Right? He wasn't the first person to do that, but he kind of formalized and gave some authority to that suggestion. And he also suggested using pictures. Right? And so we're kind of like, all the groundwork is being laid here. And once we have the New England primer as kind of a prototype, the next step really is just kind of secularizing this approach to get us to alphabet books, right? So if you don't want the biblical overtones of Adam, though, you can see how people would pretty readily jump to apple, right, as being the letter or the word that you use for A. Right? And so here, The Tragical Death of an Apple Pie, which was published by Mary Cooper in 1743. This is a contender for the first children's book, actually, right about this time, right? And of course, it would be an alphabet book, right? So children's literature and alphabet books are born together. Right? And this is actually based on a rhyme that was already in circulation. It's like if you took a nursery rhyme or like an existing sing-song and just illustrated it. And so A was an apple pie, and then it narrates. It kind of personifies the letters, right? Each of these letters gets its own little scene, right? So bit it, cut it, divided it, and it goes through the entire alphabet that way. And at about the same time, another contender for the first children's book is one by an enterprising man by the name of John Newberry, right? Who published The Little Pretty Pocket Book, and basically just the year later. And of course, that name might sound familiar because in the United States, the American Library Association gives out awards that are named after him for children's books. He's worth noting, of course, because we've got an echo of John Locke here, right? He was aware that he could put a kind of authority behind this format and have it have some educational force or some, kind of, just expertise. Because if he refers to something like instruction with delight, right? This becomes one of these catchphrases for saying, oh, okay, this looks like it's just for fun, but actually what it has a bigger purpose, right? This is going to be the sugar that helps the medicine go down. And he even gives it to you a couple of times, right? We get the picture that's instruction with delight. We also get this very elaborate title saying it's a new attempt to teach children the use of the English alphabet by way of diversion. Right? And there's actually quite a few copies of these in the world, but McGill has a very nice one. It is itself also kind of weirdly an alphabet book. So on each page, you have these little games, or it gives instructions for playing a game, which is why it's kind of a plaything. It's a guide for playing games, but it atop what we call the headers, right? It runs along the alphabet. So it's this weird hybrid format where it takes a more is more aesthetic, right? You've got your pictures, you've got rules for games, you've got morals with the rules of life. So it's got everything. And it's very cost effective, is I think also an important thing to remember. And an even better example of how publishers were trying to capitalize on this format and kind of reach what was an emerging consumer group, like children who need to be educated to learn how to read. There's another good example of a chapbook that makes this even clearer, right? This is totally riffing on the New England Primer. Right? This is from late 18th century. So even 50 years later, people are still realizing this is an effective way to sell books. You put pictures with the letters of the alphabet, you attach the moral. And what you can probably also see pretty clearly is that the printing technology hadn't come very far, right? It was still trying to be very efficient with combining pictures with images. Colors would be very expensive to produce. But we've really established this theme of we're trying to teach children to love learning by adding pictures to the alphabet. Right? So we're finally arriving in the early 19th century. And by this point, illustrated alphabets had emerged and they've gotten favor, right, as an excellent manner of enforcing the knowledge of the letters to a child's mind by identifying them with familiar objects of a visible and tangible description, right? So I would say this is about, by the early 19th century, people kind of had an idea of what alphabet books were or might be. It was just kind of waiting to see who's going to make the most attractive ones, right? But what it also did, I think that's important to think about or to connect this to. This is where I want to start asking, are alphabet books really useful for teaching people how to read, teaching children how to read? Does that answer the question from Emily Jenkins that I asked at the outset? Why are we still making alphabet books, or at least so many of them? In the Victorian era, so from 1837 to 1901, over that time span, alphabet books just exploded in popularity because they could be made affordably, right? They figured out how to make the paper, how to run the machines more efficiently. And people could justify buying them as educational tools and especially as stepping stones, right, to a better life in the middle class, right, where literacy might distinguish you from being a common laborer, right? Anyone who wanted to make an alphabet book had to meet a general expectation that it would be instructive, right, even if it was amusing, right? But they could also lean on that assumption. So anything that vaguely looked like an alphabet book gets a pass, right, for being educational. There's this great fit between the commercial aims and the technology and the consumer desires during the Industrial Revolution. And what I kind of want to wonder, and I wasn't the only one, people at the time were started wondering, right, is that explanation for the purchase correct, right? Was it maybe even covering up the real reasons people like them or produce them? So artists in the 19th century started asking the same question. And they often answered it by making satirical alphabet books. So basically, as soon as there were alphabet books for kids, the seeds of the parodic alphabet books for adults were sown. Right? That is where people started to question the arbitrary rules of this genre. And they become particularly visible in alphabets that propose a different attitude towards those rules. And especially this high value that alphabet books, at least officially, are placing on textual literacy. right? I think artists especially might be inclined to ask whether textual literacy is the be all and end all, right? And to try to make a case for appreciating illustration and for questioning the idea that images are simple, right? Or that, quote, objects of a tangible description are the best use of illustration. So we're finally segueing into Victorian alphabet books. And I wanted to share with you a couple that were made by two British men who you may have heard of, who were extremely well known on both sides of the Atlantic in those first decades of the 19th century, and who were very much not in the mold of who you probably think of as someone who writes educational books for children. So William Makepeace Thackeray, right, is best known for publishing Vanity Fair, this like amazing novel that came out in about 1848 as that's a devastating satire of British society, right, but set during the Napoleonic Wars. And so people know Thackeray as, you know, just an extraordinary satirist, right, of the 19th century. But he honed his satirical eye earlier than that. And so according to an apocryphal account for how this book came to be, Thackeray actually casually wrote and illustrated a little alphabet book sometime in the early 1830s when he met a friend's son who was crying, right, over the difficulty of learning his. On the 5th page of that very alphabet book, Thackeray explains that, you know, E stands for Eddie, and for him I took pains to compose this entertaining book. Right, so we know this is very literally a children's book. It's made for a specific child, right? And that Thackeray embraces the notion of learning how to read as being basically a child's task. And he doesn't wholly resist like the moralizing that we've seen in some of these earlier versions, because we're told that, you know, Eddie is enjoying special attention. He owes it to Thackeray to complete his task. More conventionally, right, he gets threatened with corporal punishment if he does not complete the assigned task, right? So D is a dunce, and he's been whipped more than once, presumably for not doing this kind of stuff. And you know, the I is an idler who's also been slapped for presumably not working hard enough. And this future novelist also included in this book a number of caricatures. Right, so this is, I think, a good example of a parson who would have been a local, maybe like pompous figure, and even of the queen, who I think this is meant to be a generic queen at the time. It would have been Queen Adelaide, who was the wife of King William IV, and I don't think anyone thought she was particularly unattractive. But he's alluding to visual forms, right, that at the time enjoyed a mostly adult audience, right? This idea of caricatures like this is a much more like adult-oriented form, right, towards people who are educated or politically engaged. And so similarly, one of the great visual satirists of the first half of the 19th century, George Cruikshank, also produced just a blatantly satirical comic alphabet in 1837. And this one is kind of funny because it has an accordion fold that it comes out, but it folds up very nicely, like just a little, like, you know, 4x6 sized, like, or postcard sized book. So I think it becomes easier to see here that, you know, the alphabet book format, right, is not this inevitable pedagogical response, right, to timeless qualities of childhood, right, or of literacy, right? Just the format has much more flexibility than that. And that our assumptions that alphabet books are for kids or are simple or straightforward are just really bound up in assumptions about class and education, right? So the comic alphabet concretely resembles, right, an adult-oriented form. It looks just like a series of satirical prints. Like if you've seen other Cooke prints, you recognize this kind of thing, right? Prints like this were outrageously popular in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so this is just the first half of it. And if we zero in on a couple, I think, right? So the choice of like A is for a la mode, right? That actually primes you to see the kind of material that you would usually see in satirical prints, right? These are scenes of contemporary life, right? And then that's also why it makes complete sense when F is for fashion, and, you know, so people like kind of satirizing the outrageous fashions of the day, or the silliness of one of the popular dances, right? The Q is for quadrille. But it also, I think, reveals some of the energy that's being expended to create all the conventions for these alphabet books, right? So if you look at the very first letter, A is for a la mode, And then you kind of immediately have to stumble over it, right? Because it's like A is both a letter and it's an independent word and it's part of an idiomatic expression and it's a foreign expression, right? And so I just think that Cruikshank, like right out of the gate, it's like, this is a joke, right? This has to be a joke upon the so-called simplicity of actually using the alphabet once you've learned it, right? All those rules just fall apart almost immediately. Similarly, his use of script, right, for the words in this book, I think highlights how even the letter forms are unstable, right? So there's this complication of when focusing on a printed alphabet to teach literacy. That's not usually how you're going to encounter it, or that's not as often how you're not going to, right? So the script Q here, right, is obviously quite different from the block letter Q, right? But this is the, he's using the copperplate script, right? I think that's a phrase that people probably have heard from, associated with like Jane Austen novels and things, right? And like this is the kind of script that was routinely used to inscribe the captions on satirical prints, right? So he's presuming some familiarity with that form. And Cruikshank, I think, has exposed the sheer weirdness of the alphabet book form and how it's basically the only time that we see books or letters in isolation like this, right? It's usually words rather than letters that are seen alongside images, whether it's in the form of journalistic captions, right, or as titles, for instance, of artworks. And so I think he really hammers at this with his N, right, is for nightmare, which is a joke about, how, titles would be one place where we find script alongside images. And he not only makes a joke about that, but he presumes some kind of familiarity with the contemporary art scene. Right, so Henry Fewsley's painting *The Nightmare* was put on display in the National Gallery in 1782, and it was almost immediately the subject of a whole bunch of political parodies. Right, so I've included another one from just like 1784, and you can see immediately, right, that people are assumed to have some familiarity with this painting. And right, we know this, like we still see parodies of like the Scream, right, or American Gothic. Like this, I think, is still a very familiar phenomenon, and it's not like American Gothic went on display last week. Right? You don't even have to be that up to date to be getting some of these jokes. And so Cruikshank was probably making a reference to the leader of the Afghans in the run-up to the First Anglo-Afghan War, but that some of these specific references are just lost to the sands of time. Some of them, though, I think are much more durable. And so I'll finish with Cruikshank here by showing you his most pointed riff on humans, I think, who take themselves too seriously. Right, so C is for chimpanzee, right, which points up this resemblance between this visitor to the zoo and the chimpanzee that he's observing. Not much separates us, I think. So all of the first few alphabet books that I showed you, that I pointed you that used literacy and children's books and educational obligations as a code for other social distinctions, and conventional illustrated alphabets that were framed as pedagogical tools helped us kind of learn to take for granted the idea that children are pre-literate, right, rather than illiterate. It's not a failing that they're not literate. It's just something that they're waiting to accomplish. But in a land where there is no state-sponsored education yet, which was indeed the case when Thackeray and Cruikshank were making these alphabets, we didn't have state-sponsored education in England until 1870, like the Educational Acts of 1870. Like these are kind of normalizing the idea that children are the illiterate ones, but there's definitely going to be middle and upper classes that get to learn how to read, while there are other adults who don't. So treating children as pre-readers, right, hides that reality of illiterate, lower, and working class adults. Also, it kind of ignores the fact that illustrations can appeal to adults, right, at all socioeconomic levels. And it might even be overstating the value of illustration as a pedagogical tool. And it can be a distraction, right, or it can be oversimplifying the ways that illustration can also be a rich form of printed art. Right. So I think Thackeray and Cruikshank and some of the Victorian artists and writers who came after them saw alphabet books as an opportunity to address adults and children together, or even just adults, because they want to say, look how hard this genre is working to firm up these rules when the rules just fall apart so quickly. Right? People are working so hard to insist that children are the target audience, but obviously other people can be the target audience. And so as Cruikshank does with the letter A, they especially zero in on the places in alphabet books and in the literacy instruction where the rules break down. And you realize that reading in English isn't nearly as easy as alphabet books can make it out to be. So one of the places where the rules reliably break down is at the letter X. And I do want to know what the letter X stands for in a maze. Maybe we can cover that in Q&A. So for all I know, for all anyone knows, this particular alphabet that I'm showing you now from about 1820, or one like it, may have served as a model for Thackeray, who was stumped, right? And you can see here, X, this one admits, X begins no English word, right? And I think Thackeray may have been inspired by this or something similar. Right, and commented on the frequency, right, that alphabet books would disappoint their readers at once they get to this letter. Moreover, I think it's okay if Thackeray copies. We saw previously, right, that people are riffing on the New England primer for decades. People are continuing saying A is for apple for decades, for hundreds of years, really, right? And moreover, actually, originality is probably counterproductive, right, when it comes to the alphabet. If you get too original, you're not being very educational. Some of you may be familiar with an alphabet book that Dr. Seuss wrote, right? That's called On Beyond Z, right? And he kind of presents all these forms that are kind of like letters, but not quite. But it has no educational value in that respect, right? So anyway, X has made it difficult for alphabet book composers because it doesn't follow the rules, right? There's hardly any words that start with X, right? And here's a couple of kind of common, these were anonymously authored examples. Excellent and extra were popular examples in alphabet books at the time in the 19th century because these are familiar words and people kind of were like, well, they're close enough, right? They do have the drawback of not being a noun or an object, right? So it's obviously more difficult to illustrate. You have to do a little bit more fudging. One of the best combinations of familiarity and the coincidence between spelling and pronunciation may have been that provided by X used as an indicator of ale strength. Obviously this isn't something we see now, but maybe from older cartoons, right? XX is like how you know how strong the liquor is. And so that was something that alphabet book writers would have recourse to. And also, of course, X stands for 10 in Roman numerals. So that's something that they would kind of say, oh, okay, X stands for 10. They also, there's a lot of Victorian alphabet books that also note that X was King Xerxes or Great King Xerxes, who is probably not super familiar to us now. So this is a chapbook that's from about 1800. And it's just a little, kind of like a little pamphlet, right? All in black and white and pretty crude, but very affordable. And it refers to King Xerxes, and unless you know the name of this particular king, so he ruled in the 5th century BC, the area that's now around Iraq, getting to read, the Xerxes by way of this label would probably be pretty difficult. It would be unhelpful as a means of demonstrating pronunciation, right? And as Hannah noted in the introduction, and as Judith Flanders noted a couple weeks ago, alphabetical order, arbitrary as it is, can be this very valuable binding agent for what would otherwise just be a jumble of nonsense, right? And so literary nonsense finally brings us to a writer, illustrator, triple threat artist, Edward Lear, who was, I think, one of the kings of 19th century alphabet books, right? He's clearly very familiar with 19th century trends at the time, and he smushed all of them together in one of his illustrations for the letter X. Right? He zeroes in on the letter X as a kind of ground zero for what makes his genre so very weird. Right? So this is an illustration from an illustrated alphabet that he wrote called 26 Nonsense Rhymes. Right? And he offers us the excellent double extra XX imbibing King Xerxes, who lived a long while ago. Right? And so this echoes some of these other alphabets that other people had made earlier, because he put this out in the world in 1872. But he also did a number of, throughout the 70s had done some other representations of alphabets, and even in particular King Xerxes, right? This just became his like kind of go-to get out of jail free card with the letter X, like to keep representing King Xerxes over and over again. Right? But when this is, you know, the previous version that he did, this one, sorry, when he shoves all of these together, right? I think this overflow of solutions to the problem of X highlights the lack of a single satisfying one, right? That is to say that there's this lack of sense in the alphabet book approach, right, to describing the mechanics. And we might also look askance at a children's book that is just so clearly celebrating uninhibited drinking. So I told you before that both Thackeray and George Cruikshank were serious artists in their own right, who just wanted to play with the alphabet for other, you know, for the opportunities that it offered. And Edward Lear also always wanted to be taken seriously as an artist, and he had some success in that. He was obviously extremely talented. This is just a few examples of some of other artworks that he had produced. He published sketchbooks, he produced paintings and natural history prints throughout his life, even though he actually ended up being best known for limericks. Right? And it's kind of like he just had this great success with the Book of Nonsense in 1846, and he never lived it down. Right? In 1846, he came out with the Book of Nonsense, and a lot of the content of it was just limericks. And it was a huge bestseller. There were rumors that he had invented limericks as a form. And I think this gives us an opportunity to think that if you think about how body limericks, right, play with the idea of a children's form or a kind of silly form for their effect, I think you're halfway to understanding how satirical alphabet books work. Right? There are ones for kids and there's ones for adults, and you generally know which ones are which when you see them. And in one respect, we actually do know that Lear was writing alphabet books for children, just like Thackeray was, because his correspondence and diaries revealed that as early as the 1840s, Lear was writing and illustrating nonsense alphabets for particular children that he met during visits with friends. He never married, he never had any children of his own, but he met a lot of children. And he produced more than a dozen nonsense alphabets over the course of 4 decades. There's one, this is, I think, a particularly beautiful one that's available online, that he's clearly drawing on his own personal, travel experiences and sketching. And so many elements of these did eventually find their way into some of the alphabet books that he published, and he published a whole bunch of them, especially in the 1870s. And some of these, I think, were certainly for adults, or at least the ones that adults who could appreciate a joke, right, about how ridiculous education can be. So his nonsense alphabets show how hard his contemporaries were working to make literacy, right, about the social order and productivity, right, and earning a good living by just totally rejecting those values and inverting them. And he represented alphabetical literacy as extemporaneous, right, and especially as playful, right? This was a time to sing and be silly, not a time to learn the important skills that you needed to make a living. So alphabets also offered Edward Lear a particularly potent site for playing language games and pointing out how bizarre English is. So as I've been working on and looking at alphabet books, I've just come to think of them as this giant campaign to deny and smooth over all the irregularities in linguistic and orthographic irregularities that make it so hard to learn how to speak and read and spell in English. Right, so the familiar alphabet book format of presenting a letter and an example of a word starting with that letter makes it all seem very simple. But then there's this tremendous leap to actually reading words. And that path leads through syllables, right? And so, or through phonics, really, is more probably we would think of it today. But when you try to systematize them, as people routinely did, right, when they weren't producing alphabet books, like when pedagogues were trying to be very formal and systematic about this and provide, very straightforward, like a very straightforward path through literacy, they made up these tables, right, these syllabaries. And these tables end up very systematically laying out complete nonsense, right? These are not sentences, even though they pretend to be. So Lear wrote alphabet books that bear a very striking resemblance to this kind of very formal nonsense, right? A was once an apple pie, pie-de, wide-de, tidy, pie-de, right? And it sounds silly, but it kind of also sounds like it might make kind of a sense, right? And it has readers making up words that are not words, but they sound kind of more reasonable than the carefully laid out tables. And he and his peers made fun of the rules for pronunciation too, right? Which are in English, they're just full of exceptions and inconsistencies, even though alphabet books usually try to cover that up. So if you look at this, the rhyme for "you" as an urn, right? "You, useful old urn," includes 3 different pronunciations for the letter U, right? As well as the letter's name, which is not the same thing as how it's pronounced. And so Lear just kind of like went to town on this over the course of years. And his clearest successor is Hilaire Belloc, who I think is better known for writing cautionary tales for children. But one of my favorite examples from adult alphabet books is this G stands for new, right? Spelled G-N-U, right? So the form obviously provided both writers like an effective means of exposing the cracks in this system. And throughout the 19th century, there were just more and more growing possibilities for making very beautiful books. So I think I'll close with inviting people to take a look at some of these books that are just obviously about the beauty of the letters, right? And less about really teaching anyone how to read than about inviting them to enjoy how they can look. This particular example in the center spread from a book by Walter Crane, like you can't even tell what orders the letters are supposed to be in, right? But it still offers a lot of pleasure for adults who are looking for an artistic experience or who are trying to provide an artistic experience for their children. So I think then as now, it's a good time to be shopping for alphabet books. And I look forward to hearing what other people have noticed about them, or if you have any ones that you're particularly intrigued by. So.
Thank you so much, Robin. We've had a lively discussion in the chat about the letter X and ways around representing it in various books. And it is a pickle. There was some discussion about xylophone being the most recognizable X letter in the alphabet books. And my own lived experiences these days is mainly with Dr. Zeus's ABC. My son is very young, and this is one of the books that he loves. And I'll use this one to transition because there's local traditions, of course, of alphabet books that are specific to English and then, of course, specific to other alphabets and languages as well. And us being in Canada, I always have a problem with the final letter in Dr. Zeus and every other alphabet book, but Dr. Zeus in particular, because it's like Lear, it's so much to do with the playing with words and the rhymes that make up this sort of sing-songy nature of the book. The final letter in Zeus's alphabet is a zizzer, zazzer, zuz, as you can plainly see, which works if you are south of our shared border and you pronounce Z as Z. And I have rewritten it to be like, as Zeus has plainly said for the Canadian crowd, because north of the border we do pronounce it Z. But that's one of the questions that has come up in the chat. Have you encountered any alphabet book style illustrations in other languages of different alphabets in your research? For example, Arabic, Hindi, or Japanese, or anything along those lines?
I have encountered them, and I have to say, like, I just lack the expertise to dig in with great confidence. I will say that having worked on 19th century like English texts, the British colony was just it's extending its reach, and the extent to which literacy and inscription could be also a tool of empire comes into play in this. You see this registered in alphabet books a lot because like E might stand for empire, or there's some that are I can't actually in good conscience point people to because of the representations of other nationalities or or other peoples. But you can see the difficult. I have come across 19th century colonists kind of grappling with how to translate when their alphabet book into something that makes sense to local populations. And someone like Rudyard Kipling was very interested in alphabets, and he was, you know, famously prominent as like rah like English colonist.
Right.
So, you know, they're bound together, but I think
Yeah.
it's very ripe, you know, like it would be a very fertile field for research.
Yeah, and a follow-up question along the same time period lines. Someone else asked about evidence of alphabet book style illustrations or the like in Victorian era serials or periodicals, or serialized magazines, which were so popular during the time period. Have you come across that, or can you think of examples?
Oh, there's really wonderful stuff. I mean, this brings us back to Thackeray, actually, because Punch magazine often had these very illuminated letter kind of like play, where like the first, we often see this, like the large capital letters, right, that start an article are like oversized, and they would make these very conscious callbacks to illuminated manuscripts, which would often, you know, use those first heightened letters as an opportunity to incorporate a little narrative scene, or and so they were doing, Thackeray, you know, used those kind of capital letters in Vanity Fair, if you can find, like, you know, an edition that has nicely reproduced those, but like Punch magazine included things like that. I mean, I think that there was a lot of play with the alphabet in that way, in serial form or in periodicals.
Yeah. Another comment from the Zoom chat actually was about the first Canadian, coming back to the Canadian versus American, first Canadian alphabet book. And she lists an illustrated comic alphabet by Amelia Frances Howard Gibbon. And we do have a couple examples in our collection, not available online, but we do have a couple physical examples. And it's an interesting contrast, the national differences, British versus American versus Canadian specific illustrated comics. So it's more of a comment than a question, but it's an interesting example to compare with.
I'm looking at it, like all these wonderful, like suggestions, and it's just there are just so many, and it's such a just a fertile field for artists to play in, obviously.
Yeah. One other follow-up question here is, and we are keeping an eye. It's 12:56, so we will wrap up with. If you have any final questions, pop them in the chat. But one person asked if you've encountered any that play with the alphabetical order. So if you have an alphabet book that doesn't follow the traditional democratic A through Z.
Oh, I feel like there is one. I can't. I feel like I have
Z. I said Z.
Yeah. Something that is kind of funny, I think, is that even in the Cruikshank one, I almost, kind of thought about taking this. Sometimes I and J are treated together, or they are switched. Same with U and V, because that, that order wasn't necessarily hammered out at that point. Even by the mid-19th century, you would find dictionaries that would list all of the, that would treat I and J as the same letter functionally. And so then you couldn't, there were almost no words, right, that start with IA. And so the J would come first because it would be a JA word. Right. And so there are definitely alphabet books that now you'll see they only have 24 letters, or they list V before U and they put I before J. So there are ones that are out of order, and it's not always a joke. I think they're also out there too, where people have noticed that was the case and started playing with it.
Yeah, one of the comments in the chat was actually offering a solution to the X problem, taken from A, the tragical A volume that you showed at the beginning, and the solution was to clump those letters together. What is it? X, Y, and Z and ampersand?
Yeah.
All wished for a piece in hand. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a neat solution to that pickle of the X not starting a word, or that X sound not starting a word. So we've kind of fixated on the letter X in the chat, but thank you so much, Robin. I'm going to hand it actually back to Nathalie Cooke. She's going to give us a couple closing remarks, but a huge thank you to you from me.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, huge thanks. This was absolutely terrific. So I'm thrilled that we've been able to transition to this slightly different format, which allows for this rich exchange. That we'll send the chat to you, Robin, because you'll be fascinated to see some of the comments that are coming through. And in turn, we'll be sure to follow up for those who are attending with an email that gives the link to the talk and probably some follow-up information about our collections. Huge thanks to you, Robin. It was really terrific. It was fabulous. And the fact that we've generated so much comment shows the enthusiasm. You'll see it. To the Roar team who made this possible, to Jacquelyn, who's actually sitting in my office. And if you look just slightly to the right, you would see the sample of our Amaze alphabet book on my standing desk over there. Also to Hannah Deskin, who was involved in producing Amaze, who you heard in the introduction. And to those you haven't seen on our team, Michelle McLeod and Catherine Lewis, who were surveying the chat and helping with tech problems. Also to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, without whom these kinds of events couldn't be possible. And to generous private sponsors, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley, who have been absolutely terrific. We really do rely on private donations, and so that's hugely appreciated. But most of all, thank you for coming, and thank you not only for being here, but for being such thoughtful and articulate commentators in the chat. It enriches these events no end. So let me ask that you bear in mind our future events. The next one is going to be on February the 18th. It's a virtual event and it's called Rare Stitches, knitting inspired by illuminated manuscripts with historian and knitter, Kristen Howard. You're going to come away with a new understanding of book history, but you're also going to come away with modern color work knitting patterns. So it's going to be a kind of a hands-on craft event as well as a historical talk. On February the 24th, that will be the next meeting of the Roar Book Club. This is going to be about the books we love, reading in hard times, and that will be led by the head of Rare Books and Special Collections, Chris Lyons. The third will take place on March the 16th. This is going to be the final event in our three-part series with special guest Clara Drummond, and again, we'll be talking about alphabet books. And of course, this is all leading up to the moment of wonder for our own book, Amaze, which we will launch on March the 30th. We have subtitled it in French, the Abécédaire, and you'll see that pull out in the A. And yes, for Z, we did use zebra, but it's a beautiful one and there's a pull out too. And I think you will be absolutely thrilled with this book. So we'll send you information about it, and we should be able to have it on sale at least by mid-March, and we'll launch in March. Huge thanks to everyone. Hope to see you again.
Thanks again, Robin. Much appreciated.